October 26, 1942. Lieutenant Stanley Vejtasa was climbing through solid cloud at full throttle when his radio went dead. He could not see the end of the flight deck behind him. He could not see his wingman ahead. He was flying blind, punching through fog at 200 miles per hour in a Grumman F4F Wildcat, a stubby little fighter with 650 caliber machine guns and barely 20 seconds of ammunition per gun. Below him, somewhere in the grey murk, sat the aircraft carrier USS Enterprise, the only operational American fleet carrier left in the entire Pacific Ocean. Ahead of him, closing fast from the northwest, were over 100 Japanese aircraft launched from 4 carriers. They were coming to sink the Enterprise. They were coming to win the war. Vejtasa had been a fighter pilot for exactly 4 months. Before that, he had been a dive bomber pilot. Before that, he had been a college wrestler from a tiny town in eastern Montana that most Americans could not find on a map. In the next 2 hours, he would shoot down 7 Japanese aircraft in a single sortie, 5 of them in roughly 15 minutes, and he would do it in an airplane that was slower, less maneuverable, and more lightly armed than almost everything the Japanese threw at him. His commanding officer would call it the greatest single combat fight record in the history of air warfare. The United States Navy would recommend him for the Medal of Honor, then the Navy would take it away. This is the story of the man they called Swede, and the 15 minutes that should have changed history. Stanley Winfield Vejtasa was born on July 27, 1914, on a homestead near the tiny town of Paris in Macon County, eastern Montana. His father John had emigrated from Bohemia, part of what was then the Austro-Hungarian Empire. His mother Inga Rinhagen came from Norway. They had settled on a patch of dry Montana prairie because the land was cheap and the government was giving it away under the Homestead Act. The family name was Czech, pronounced Vejtasa, but nobody in rural Montana could say it right, so they just called the boy Swede. The nickname made no sense. He was not Swedish. He was Czech and Norwegian, but the name stuck for the rest of his life, through flight school, through combat, through 31 years in the United States Navy. The Vejtasa homestead was hard scrabble country, flat prairie stretching to the horizon in every direction, temperatures that dropped to 30 below in winter, summer heat that cracked the earth. It was the kind of place where a boy learned to work before he learned to read, where chores started before dawn and ended after dark, where self-reliance was not a virtue but a survival requirement. The family eventually moved to Circle, Montana, a ranching town of a few hundred people, and the county seat of Macon County. Stanley attended Circle High School. He was a natural athlete, strong and fast, with a competitive streak that bordered on obsessive. He competed in everything. He won most of it. His classmates remembered a quiet, focused kid who did not talk much but refused to lose at anything. After graduation, Vejtasa enrolled at Montana State College in Bozeman, where he studied physical education and forestry. He wrestled competitively. He played basketball. He ran track. He was good enough at wrestling to earn respect, but not good enough to go national. After 2 years at Montana State, he transferred to the University of Montana in Missoula for his 3rd year. But college could not hold him. He was restless in a way that classrooms could not fix. He wanted something bigger, something faster, and something that would take him off the Montana plains and into the sky. He wanted to fly. In 1937, Vejtasa walked into a Navy recruiting office and signed up. He was accepted as an aviation cadet on July 5, 1938, and reported to Naval Air Station Pensacola, Florida, for flight training. Pensacola was the crucible where the Navy made its pilots. The training was demanding, the washout rate was savage. Cadets who could not handle the physical punishment, the academic load, or the sheer terror of landing on a pitching flight deck were sent home. Vejtasa did not wash out. He thrived. He earned his wings and was designated a naval aviator on July 13, 1939. The Navy commissioned him as an ensign in the Naval Reserve, then transferred him to the regular Navy. On August 19, his first fleet assignment was scouting Squadron 5 aboard the aircraft carrier USS Yorktown. He was 25 years old, a ranch kid from Montana who now flew off the deck of a warship for a living. He was exactly where he wanted to be. His initial fleet assignment put him in the cockpit of the Curtiss SBC-3 Helldiver, a biplane scout bomber that was already obsolete by the time he reached the squadron. The Helldiver was slow, fragile, and looked like it belonged in the previous war. But it taught Vejtasa the fundamentals of carrier aviation, the gut-wrenching art of launching from and landing on a pitching steel deck barely 600 feet long, surrounded by open ocean in every direction. Within months, the squadron transitioned to the Douglas SBD Dauntless, a modern monoplane dive bomber that would become one of the most important aircraft of the Pacific War. The Dauntless was not glamorous. It was slow. It was underpowered. The pilots called it slow but deadly. But it was tough, accurate, and capable of delivering a 1,000-pound bomb from near vertical dives with remarkable precision. Flying the Dauntless required nerve. The pilot would push over into a 70-degree dive from 10 to 15,000 feet, hold the aircraft steady against buffeting and wind, release the bomb at 2,500 feet, and then pull out of the dive while anti-aircraft fire tried to kill him. Vejtasa practiced this maneuver thousands of times. He could hit a target the size of a tennis court from 3 miles up. The dive bomber was his classroom, and precision was the lesson. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, Vejtasa was already at sea aboard Yorktown. The Pacific War had begun. Within weeks, the American carriers were striking back. On February 1, 1942, Yorktown's air group hit Japanese positions in the Marshall and Gilbert Islands. It was one of the first American offensive operations of the war. Vejtasa flew his Dauntless through heavy weather and anti-aircraft fire, pressing his attacks with the cold precision that would define his career. The Navy noticed. On March 10, 1942, Yorktown launched a daring strike across the Stanley Mountains in New Guinea, targeting Japanese shipping and transports at Lae and Salamaua. It was a long-range raid over some of the most treacherous terrain on Earth. The aircraft had to fly through mountain passes, shrouded in cloud, navigate by dead reckoning, and then dive through heavy anti-aircraft fire onto ships anchored in the harbors. Vejtasa pushed his Dauntless into a steep dive and scored a direct hit on a Japanese vessel. For this action, the Navy awarded him his first Navy Cross, the second highest decoration for valor in the United States Navy. He was 27 years old and already one of the most decorated dive bomber pilots in the Pacific Fleet. 2 months later, in May 1942, came the Battle of the Coral Sea, the first carrier versus carrier engagement in the history of naval warfare. Neither fleet ever saw the other. The entire battle was fought by aircraft, launched from carriers that were over 100 miles apart. On May 7th, Vejtasa helped sink the Japanese light carrier Shoho. It was the first Japanese carrier lost in the war. American pilots swarmed the Shoho from every angle. Lieutenant Commander Robert Dixon, leading a squadron from the carrier Lexington, sent the famous radio message, "Scratch one flat top." The next day, May 8th, while flying an anti-submarine patrol around Yorktown in his Dauntless dive bomber, Vejtasa spotted Japanese attack aircraft inbound on the carrier. What happened next was extraordinary by any standard. Vejtasa, flying a slow, heavy 2-seat dive bomber, armed with only 2 forward-firing 50-caliber machine guns, engaged Japanese aircraft in air-to-air combat. He was credited with 3 enemy aircraft destroyed, though post-war analysis of Japanese records has cast doubt on whether all 3 were actually downed. What is not in dispute is that a dive bomber pilot had engaged enemy fighters and survived, an extraordinary feat by any standard. The Navy awarded him his second Navy Cross. 2 Navy Crosses by the age of 27. Vejtasa had proven himself one of the most talented and aggressive combat aviators in the Pacific Fleet, but the Navy had other plans for him. In the summer of 1942, with Yorktown sunk at Midway on June 7 and the carrier war reaching a crisis, the Navy desperately needed experienced combat pilots in fighter cockpits. The Americans were losing pilots faster than they could train replacements. Vejtasa was reassigned from dive bombers to fighters. He would fly the Grumman F4F Wildcat, a stubby, rugged, barrel-chested, single-seat fighter armed with 650 caliber Browning machine guns. He joined Fighting Squadron 10, the Grim Reapers, under the command of Lieutenant Commander James Henry Flatley, one of the finest fighter tacticians in the United States Navy. Flatley made Vejtasa his operations officer, the number 2 position in the squadron. The Wildcat was a capable aircraft, but it had critical limitations that every Navy fighter pilot had to understand or die learning. The Japanese Mitsubishi A6M0 was faster in level flight by 30 to 40 knots. It climbed better. It could turn inside the Wildcat with ease, completing a 360-degree turn in a tighter radius and in less time. In a classic one-on-one turning dogfight, the kind depicted in Hollywood films, the Zero would win every single time. A Wildcat pilot who tried to turn with a Zero was a dead Wildcat pilot. The American fighters did have advantages, but they were not the kind of advantages that looked good in movies. The Wildcat was tougher. It had self-sealing fuel tanks that closed bullet holes automatically, preventing fuel leaks from becoming fires. It had armor plating behind the pilot's seat that could stop a rifle-caliber bullet. The Zero had none of these features. A single incendiary round in a Zero's fuel tank could turn the aircraft into a fireball. The Wildcat also had heavier armament. 650 caliber Browning machine guns threw a devastating volume of fire that could tear apart a lightly built Japanese aircraft in a 1-second burst. Flatley knew how to exploit every one of these advantages. He drilled his pilots relentlessly in tactics designed to fight the Zero on American terms, not Japanese terms. The key tactic was the Thack weave, developed by Lieutenant Commander John Thack in late 1941 after intelligence reports revealed the Zero's extraordinary maneuverability. Thack had first tested it in combat at the Battle of Midway in June 1942, and it worked. The concept was elegant. Wildcat pilots flew in pairs, weaving back and forth in a scissoring pattern so that each pilot covered his partner's tail. If a Zero got behind one Wildcat, the other would turn into the attack and catch the Zero in a deadly crossfire. The tactic turned every engagement into a trap. Flatley also developed specific doctrine for intercepting torpedo bombers. Instead of making high-speed slashing attacks from above, which gave the fighter only a brief firing window, Flatley trained his pilots to dive down and join the torpedo bomber formation at close range, matching their speed, flying alongside them. This neutralized the rear gunner crossfire that made head-on attacks so dangerous. Vejtasa practiced these tactics until they were muscle memory. By October 1942, the war in the Pacific had reached its most dangerous moment. The struggle for Guadalcanal, the first major American ground offensive of the war, was hanging by a thread. The Marines on the island were holding Henderson Field, the critical airstrip, against relentless Japanese ground attacks. Every few nights, Japanese warships bombarded the airfield with heavy naval guns, cratering the runway, destroying aircraft on the ground, killing Marines in their foxholes. The Japanese Navy was running reinforcements and supplies down the narrow waters between the Solomon Islands almost every night, a route the Marines bitterly named the Tokyo Express. Fast Japanese destroyers loaded with troops and equipment would race down the slot, unload at Guadalcanal under cover of darkness, and be gone before dawn. The American Navy could not stop them because it could not control the waters around the island. Control of those waters depended on carriers. The Japanese still had 4 operational fleet and light carriers in the South Pacific, the fleet carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku, both veterans of Pearl Harbor and the Coral Sea, the light carrier Zuiho, and the carrier Junyo operating independently. The Americans had exactly 2, the Enterprise and the Hornet. If those 2 carriers were sunk, the Marines on Guadalcanal would be cut off from naval air support, from resupply, from evacuation. The island would fall. The entire American strategy in the Pacific, the strategy that depended on holding Guadalcanal as the first step in a Long Island hopping advance toward Japan, would collapse. Vice Admiral William Frederick Halsey had just taken command of the South Pacific Theater on October 18, replacing the exhausted Vice Admiral Robert Gormley. Halsey's orders were aggressive. When patrol aircraft spotted the Japanese carrier force approaching Guadalcanal on October 25, Halsey sent a 2-word message to Rear Admiral Thomas Cassin Kinkaid, who commanded the American Carrier Task Force. Attack! Repeat, attack! Kinkaid had Task Force 16 built around Enterprise, with the battleships South Dakota, cruisers, and destroyers. Task Force 17 was built around Hornet with its own screen. Together, they sailed northwest to intercept the Japanese carriers. On the evening of October 25, Kinkaid ordered a long-range strike from Enterprise toward a reported Japanese position 360 miles distant. The distance was well beyond safe combat radius for the aircraft involved. Vejtasa led the 8-fighter escort for the 23 plane strike package. In the ready room before launch, he did not hide his opinion. He openly called the order reckless. The strike found nothing. The aircraft returned after dark to a blacked-out carrier deck pitching in heavy seas. Several aircraft were lost in landing accidents. Pilots crashed into the barriers. Others went into the ocean. It was a debacle, and Vejtasa had made his feelings about Kincaid's judgment known to every officer within earshot. Kincaid, commanding his first carrier task force, and keenly aware that Halsey was watching his performance, would remember every word. Dawn, on October 26, 1942. The American and Japanese carrier forces were roughly 200 miles apart, somewhere north of the Santa Cruz Islands in the southern Solomons. Both sides launched search planes at first light. Both sides found each other almost simultaneously. The Japanese launched first, a coordinated strike of 64 aircraft from Shokaku, Zuikaku, and Zuiho, a mix of Zero fighters, Val dive bombers, and Kate torpedo bombers. The American strike went out minutes later, heading northwest toward the Japanese carriers. The two formations actually passed each other in the air, going in opposite directions. Pilots on both sides stared at one another through their canopies and kept flying. They each had their own targets to reach. Enterprise scrambled her combat air patrol into the overcast sky. Vejtasa's 4-plane division, call sign Reaper 7, was ordered aloft. The division consisted of Vejtasa as leader, Lieutenant Leroy Harris, a Texan everyone called Tex, and 2 ensigns, Willis Redding, known as Chip, and William Leader, called Hank. They launched into heavy weather, climbing through solid overcast on instruments alone. Vejtasa later recalled that he could barely see the flight deck as he left it. He took off at full throttle in a right climbing turn, punching up through the fog layer. The fighter direction officer aboard Enterprise was inexperienced. Halsey had pulled the ship's veteran radar controller to his headquarters at Noumea. The replacement was overwhelmed by the scale and speed of the incoming Japanese attack. The combat air patrol was poorly stacked, at the wrong altitudes, pointed in the wrong directions. The Japanese strike was inbound at 200 knots, and the American defenders were fumbling in the dark. If you want to know what Swede Vejtasa did next, please like this video. Every like pushes this story to someone who has never heard his name, and he deserves to be heard. Please subscribe. We dig through Navy archives, through carrier action reports, through Navy cross citations to find men like Vejtasa. Men who were passed over, men whose medals were downgraded, men whose stories sat in filing cabinets for decades while the world moved on. We pull them out and tell their stories every week. Back to Vejtasa. The first Japanese strike concentrated on Hornet. Val dive bombers screamed down from 15,000 feet, while Kate torpedo bombers skimmed the wave tops from multiple angles. 3 bombs struck Hornet's flight deck, blowing holes in the wooden planking, igniting fires, destroying parked aircraft. 2 torpedoes slammed into her hull on the starboard side, flooding engine rooms and killing sailors in the darkness below the waterline. 2 damaged Japanese aircraft crashed into the ship in rapid succession. The first, a Val dive bomber piloted by Warrant Officer Shigeyuki Sato, struck the stack and tumbled onto the flight deck. The second, another damaged Val, flew into the port-side gun gallery near the forward elevator and exploded on impact. The aviation fuel in the wreckage ignited fires that spread through the ship's island superstructure. Within minutes, Hornet was burning, listing, and dead in the water. Her engines were gone. Her flight deck was wrecked. She would never launch or recover another aircraft. The Americans had just lost half their carrier strength in the Pacific Ocean in under 10 minutes. Vejtasa's division was initially vectored to the wrong sector by the overwhelmed fighter direction officer. By the time they reached the Japanese strike, the first wave had already savaged Hornet. But stragglers remained. Japanese dive bombers, damaged or disoriented, were heading back toward their carriers in scattered groups. Vejtasa spotted 2 Aichi D-3A dive bombers, the aircraft the Americans called Vals. They were fixed-gear, single-engine aircraft with a distinctive appearance, almost elegant in their lines, but slow and vulnerable without fighter escort. These 2 were alone, separated from their formation. One appeared to be searching for the Japanese carriers, looking down at the ocean instead of behind him for enemy fighters. Vejtasa closed on the first Val from above and behind. The pilot never saw him coming. Vejtasa fired a short, precise burst from his .650 caliber guns. The armor-piercing and incendiary rounds punched through the Val's engine, cowling, and fuel tanks. The aircraft came apart in mid-air. He banked hard, scanned for the second Val, found it, and shot it down with another controlled burst. 2 kills. His ammunition counters were clicking downward. He had maybe 500 rounds remaining across 6 guns. He would need every one of them. At approximately 11:35 that morning, Enterprise's radar detected a second incoming strike wave. This one was different from the first. This was a torpedo strike from the carrier Zuikaku, 16 Nakajima B-5N torpedo bombers, the aircraft Americans called Kates. Each Kate carried a crew of 3, a pilot, an observer, and a rear gunner. Each carried a Type 91 aerial torpedo slung beneath the fuselage, a weapon weighing over 1,800 pounds that ran straight and true at 42 knots once it hit the water. The Kate Torpedo Squadron was led by Lieutenant Shigeichiro Imajuku, a veteran torpedo pilot from Zuikaku's air group. The man who had originally led the Pearl Harbor torpedo attack, Lieutenant Commander Shigeharu Murata, had already been killed that morning. Murata had led the first strike against Hornet 2 hours earlier. His Kate was shot down by Hornet's anti-aircraft guns during that attack. The pilots now heading for Enterprise were his successors, and they were every bit as dangerous. The Kates came in low, skimming the wave tops at barely 50 feet above the ocean surface, approaching from multiple angles to box in the carrier and make evasion impossible. Their tactic was to fan out at the last moment and launch torpedoes simultaneously from both sides of the target, creating a pattern that no amount of ship handling could avoid. A single torpedo hit below Enterprise's waterline could cripple her. 2 or 3 would sink her. And if Enterprise sank, the United States would have 0 operational fleet carriers in the entire Pacific Ocean. 0. The Marines on Guadalcanal would be abandoned. The Japanese would control the sea and the air. The Pacific War would be lost. Ensign Hank Leader, flying on Vejtasa's wing, spotted them first. He keyed his radio. Enemy aircraft, 9 o'clock low. Vejtasa looked left and down. There they were. 16 torpedo bombers skimming the ocean, their engines straining at full power. Silver torpedoes clearly visible beneath their fuselages, heading straight for Enterprise in a tight, disciplined formation. Behind them, the ocean stretched out flat and grey to the horizon. Ahead of them, Enterprise was turning hard to starboard, her wake curving white against the dark water as Captain Osborne Hardison, who had taken command of the ship less than a week earlier, fought to present the narrowest possible target. Hardison had replaced Captain Arthur Davis with almost no transition time. He had been in command for less than a week. Now he was fighting for the survival of his ship and, with it, the survival of American naval power in the Pacific. Every second of ship handling mattered. A carrier that turned too slowly or too late would present its full broadside to incoming torpedoes, a target over 800 feet long and impossible to miss. Vejtasa made his decision in seconds. He remembered everything Flatley had taught them. He rolled his Wildcat into a steep diving turn, leading his 3 wingmen down from altitude directly into the Kate formation. He did not attack from above in a high-speed slashing pass. Instead, he dove down to the Kate's altitude and joined their formation at close range, matching their speed, flying alongside them as if he were one of their own. This was not reckless bravado. It was calculated tactical brilliance. The Kates defended themselves with interlocking fields of fire from their rear gunners. Any fighter attacking from behind or above would fly into a wall of 7.7mm bullets from multiple aircraft simultaneously. But a fighter that joined the formation at close range, flying wingtip to wingtip with the bombers, neutralized the crossfire completely. The rear gunners could not shoot sideways without hitting their own planes. Vejtasa opened fire on the lead Kate. His 50 caliber rounds, 6 streams of heavy bullets converging at a point 200 yards ahead of his guns, tore into the aircraft. He blew the rudder clean off. The Kate lurched sideways, lost control, and crashed into the ocean in a spray of white water. He shifted his aim to the next aircraft in the formation. Another burst. The Kate's engine exploded. It nosed over and hit the water at 150 knots. The formation was breaking apart now. Japanese pilots, who had trained for years, who had practiced torpedo runs until they could launch in their sleep, were panicking. Some turned away from Enterprise. Some jettisoned their torpedoes and ran. Some pressed on alone. Vejtasa pursued them. He was firing in short, controlled bursts of 3 to 5 rounds, conserving every bullet. picking his targets with the precision of a man who had spent 3 years dropping bombs from 15,000 feet onto targets the size of a ship's deck. That same discipline now guided his gunnery. 3 Kates down. 4. 5. The torpedo attack was shattered. Japanese pilots who had survived Pearl Harbor, who had struck British warships in the Indian Ocean, who had attacked American carriers at Coral Sea, were scattering in every direction. Vejtasa and his 3 wingmen had broken the most dangerous torpedo formation in the Pacific. Vejtasa closed on a 6th Kate that was trailing smoke, losing altitude, clearly doomed. He pursued it to within 50 feet and fired his remaining ammunition into the crippled aircraft. The Kate exploded in a massive fireball directly in front of his Wildcat. The blast wave slammed into his aircraft like a wall. Smoke and debris filled his cockpit. His Wildcat was thrown violently sideways. For a terrible moment, he thought he was finished. The burning wreckage of the Kate did not crash into the sea. Instead, it flew directly into the destroyer USS Smith, striking her forecastle and detonating. The Kate's torpedo, still armed, cooked off in the fire. The explosion devastated the forward section of the ship. Dozens of sailors were killed or wounded. The ship's commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander Hunter Wood, Jr., saved his vessel with an act of desperate seamanship. He drove Smith directly into the foaming wake of the battleship South Dakota, using the churning water to drown the fires consuming his bow. Vejtasa steadied his battered Wildcat. His ammunition was gone. His cockpit reeked of smoke and burning oil. Bullet holes from Kate rear gunners stitched across his wings and fuselage. He turned back toward Enterprise and headed for the flight deck. Behind him, the wreckage of the torpedo strike littered the ocean surface. Burning fuel slicks spread across the grey water. Floating debris marked the graves of Japanese aircraft and their crews. Lieutenant Imajuku, who had led the Zuikaku torpedo squadron against Enterprise, was among the dead. What is certain is that the carefully planned torpedo formation was shattered before it could deliver a coordinated attack. Enterprise took no torpedo hits that morning. Not one. She was still afloat, still fighting, still the only fleet carrier the United States had in the Pacific. When Vejtasa's Wildcat touched down on Enterprise's flight deck, his landing was nearly fatal for a completely different reason. Another pilot, Ensign Edward Colson, was landing simultaneously from a different approach angle. The 2 aircraft came within feet of a collision that would have killed both men instantly. The flight deck of a carrier in combat was one of the most dangerous workplaces on Earth, even without aircraft nearly colliding. Ordnance was scattered across the deck. Fuel lines were exposed. Firefighting crews were still battling blazes from the 2 bomb hits Enterprise had taken earlier that morning. Vejtasa did not learn how close he had come to dying on his own flight deck until someone told him hours afterward. He had survived the most intense aerial combat of the Pacific War, only to nearly die in a landing accident. It is important to note that Vejtasa did not save Enterprise alone. The anti-aircraft gunners aboard the battleship South Dakota had been pouring fire into the Japanese aircraft throughout the torpedo attack. South Dakota's crew claimed 26 enemy aircraft destroyed during the battle, though modern historians regard that number as significantly inflated. Japan lost 99 aircraft total across the entire battle, and the combined anti-aircraft fire of all Task Force 16 ships likely accounted for closer to 13 to 15 of those. But even the most conservative estimates acknowledge that the wall of flak from South Dakota and the escorts forced many Japanese pilots to release their torpedoes at extreme range. Captain Hardison's ship handling kept Enterprise turning and twisting through the torpedo patterns. What Vejtasa and his 3 wingmen did was break the formation before it could deliver a coordinated attack. They shattered the torpedo pattern at the point of maximum danger when the Kates were converging for their final approach. That was the decisive intervention. Everything else, the anti-aircraft fire, the ship handling, the evasive maneuvering, was more effective because the formation had already been broken from above. Enterprise's landing signal officer that day was Lieutenant Robin Lindsay. Working with handheld paddles on the exposed fantail of a carrier that had been hit by 2 bombs, with damaged aircraft circling overhead, some trailing smoke, some leaking fuel, some with wounded pilots barely conscious at the controls, Lindsay guided every one of them home. Years later, when a journalist asked Vejtasa if he considered himself a hero, he said no. That honor, he said, belonged to Robin Lindsay. The Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands was over by nightfall on October 26. The tactical scoreboard favored the Japanese. Hornet was sunk. Enterprise was damaged by 2 bomb hits and 2 damaging near misses that buckled hull plating and opened fuel tanks to the sea. A destroyer had been gutted. The United States Navy had lost its numerical advantage in carriers, but the strategic ledger told a very different story. The Japanese had lost over 100 aircraft and, far more critically, the irreplaceable veteran aircrews who flew them, torpedo pilots who had attacked Pearl Harbor, dive bomber crews who had struck at Midway, fighter pilots who had fought in every major engagement since December 1941. They were gone, killed over the Santa Cruz Islands, or lost in the ocean trying to find their carriers afterward. Japan's pilot training pipeline was already strained to breaking point. These men could not be replaced in months. They could not be replaced in years. The Japanese carrier force would never fully recover from these aircrew losses. Santa Cruz was a tactical Japanese victory that planted the seeds of their ultimate strategic defeat. Enterprise herself became the living proof of what Vejtasa's fight had preserved. Repaired in just 2 weeks at Noumea, she sailed back into combat for the naval battle of Guadalcanal in mid-November 1942, the engagement that finally broke Japanese naval dominance around the island. Her aircraft helped sink the Japanese battleship Hiei. She went on to fight at the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, where American carrier pilots destroyed over 300 Japanese aircraft in what became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. She fought at Leyte Gulf in October 1944, the largest naval battle in history. She earned 20 battle stars during the war, more than any other ship in the United States Navy. Every one of those battle stars, happened because Enterprise survived October 26, 1942. Every Marine who was eventually evacuated from Guadalcanal, every island that was liberated in the Central Pacific Drive, every bombing mission that flew from captured airfields, all of it traced back, in part, to a carrier that survived because 4 Wildcat fighters broke a torpedo attack on a grey morning in the South Pacific. Aboard Enterprise that evening, Lieutenant Commander Flatley sat down with Vejtasa's logbook and wrote across the page, "Greatest single combat fight record in the history of air warfare. Congratulations." Flatley had seen brave pilots fight and die across 2 oceans. He had led fighter squadrons against the best the Japanese had. He had never seen anything like what Vejtasa did that morning. 7 confirmed kills in a single mission, 2 Val dive bombers and 5 Kate torpedo bombers. A torpedo attack that could have ended the Pacific War, broken by 4 Wildcats led by a man who had been flying fighters for 4 months. Flatley submitted a formal recommendation for the Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration in the United States. The evidence was overwhelming. 7 enemy aircraft destroyed in a single sortie. The last American carrier in the Pacific saved from torpedo attack. The enemy torpedo formation completely shattered. Eyewitness testimony from multiple pilots and ship's personnel. Flatley's recommendation went up the chain of command to Rear Admiral Kincaid. Kincaid read the recommendation carefully. Then he downgraded it. Instead of the Medal of Honor, Kincaid approved a Distinguished Flying Cross, a decoration several levels below the nation's highest award. The decision stunned Flatley and the officers of Air Group 10. The Medal of Honor was reserved for actions that went conspicuously above and beyond the call of duty at the risk of life. Vejtasa had voluntarily engaged 16 torpedo bombers with 4 fighters, had personally destroyed 5 of them in minutes, had saved the last American carrier in the Pacific from destruction, and had nearly been killed by the explosion of the 6th aircraft he attacked. By any reasonable interpretation of the criteria, the action qualified. A Distinguished Flying Cross was typically awarded for a single kill or a well-executed mission, not for a performance that an officer of Flatley's experience called the greatest in the history of air warfare. 7 kills in a single sortie, with the entire Pacific War potentially hanging in the balance, warranted more, far more. The reason for the downgrade was never officially stated in any document that has survived, but the officers aboard Enterprise believed they knew. Vejtasa had openly, loudly, and publicly criticized Kincaid's tactical judgment in the ready room the night before the battle. He had called the long-range strike on October 25 a waste of aircraft and lives. He had been right. The strike found nothing and lost aircraft in the recovery. But being right does not protect a lieutenant from an admiral's wounded pride. Kincaid had been embarrassed in front of his own officers. The Medal of Honor recommendation died on his desk, downgraded to the equivalent of a participation trophy for a man who had just set a Navy record. The paperwork continued up the chain to Vice Admiral Halsey. Halsey reviewed the case and the evidence. He recognized the inadequacy of the Distinguished Flying Cross for what Vejtasa had accomplished. Halsey overruled Kincaid's downgrade, but he did not restore the Medal of Honor recommendation. Instead, Halsey approved a Navy Cross, Vejtasa's third, making him one of the most decorated aviators in the Pacific Fleet. The Navy Cross was significant, the second highest valor decoration in the Navy, but it was not the Medal of Honor. The greatest single-mission fighter performance in the history of Navy aviation was rewarded with the same medal Vejtasa had already earned twice before, for actions far less consequential. Vejtasa accepted the award without complaint. He did not lobby, he did not write letters, he did not give interviews. He went back to the cockpit and kept fighting. In November 1942, he flew additional combat missions from Enterprise during the naval battle of Guadalcanal, including an engagement on November 13, where he shared credit for destroying a Japanese Kawanishi flying boat. His final wartime tally reached 10.25 confirmed aerial victories, placing him among the Navy's leading aces. In May 1943, Vejtasa was detached from the Grim Reapers and sent back to the United States to train new fighter pilots. The Navy needed his combat experience in training squadrons more than in a cockpit. He served as a flight instructor at Naval Air Station, Atlantic City, then at Quonset Point, Rhode Island. He commanded Fighting Squadron 97 in late 1944 and Air Group 44 in 1945. The war ended before he could return to the Pacific. After the war, Vejtasa's career continued to advance through a series of important assignments, though he never reached the rank that his wartime record might have predicted. He served as air officer aboard the carrier USS Essex during 2 Korean War deployments in the early 1950s. He attended the Naval War College in 1956. He commanded the ammunition ship USS Firedrake. In November 1962, he was given the most prestigious seagoing command available to a naval aviator. He became commanding officer of USS Constellation, the Navy's newest supercarrier. 3 flight deck accidents during his tour aboard Constellation, none caused by his negligence, damaged his prospects for promotion to flag rank. He later served as Commander Fleet Air Miramar in Southern California, where he oversaw fighter training programs and played a significant role in laying the groundwork for the Navy Fighter Weapons School, the program the world would come to know as Top Gun. The irony was rich. The man who had set the Navy's single-mission air combat record was helping build the school that would train the next generation of fighter pilots to do what he had done instinctively, to fight outnumbered, outgunned, and win. Vejtasa never received public credit for his role in Top Gun's creation. The program launched formally in 1969, under different leadership. But the doctrine it taught, aggressive tactical flying, precise gunnery, the willingness to close to knife-fighting range with the enemy, those principles carried the DNA of what Swede Vejtasa had demonstrated over the Santa Cruz Islands 27 years earlier. Captain Stanley Vejtasa retired from the United States Navy on July 1, 1970, after 31 years of service. He never made admiral. The man who had saved Enterprise, who held 3 Navy crosses, who held the single-mission air combat record for the Navy, retired 1 star short of flag rank. He spent 25 years after the Navy working as secretary of the Ray River Ranch Corporation, living quietly in Texas. He did not seek publicity. He did not attend air shows or give speeches about his exploits. He raised his family. He went to work. He lived like a man who had nothing to prove. In 2012, 70 years after the Battle of Santa Cruz, supporters of Vejtasa formally petitioned the Department of Defense to upgrade his 3rd Navy Cross to the Medal of Honor. The petition included the original wartime documentation, Flatley's recommendation, the eyewitness statements, the action reports, and the historical analysis showing Kincaid's downgrade and its likely motivation. The petition was reviewed through official channels. It was denied. The Medal of Honor that James Flatley had recommended on the deck of Enterprise in October 1942 would never be awarded. Vejtasa died on January 23, 2013, at the age of 98. His wife, Irene, had preceded him in death in 2004. They had 3 children. His ashes were scattered at sea, returned to the Pacific Ocean where he had fought and bled and set records that still stand. He was inducted into the Carrier Aviation Hall of Fame in 1987. The Gathering of Eagles Foundation honored him in 1996 and again in 2004. No ship bears his name. No monument stands in Circle, Montana. No film has told his story. The question that haunts this story is not whether Vejtasa deserved the Medal of Honor. His commanding officer said he did the day it happened. The evidence said he did. The Navy's own criteria for extraordinary heroism above and beyond the call of duty said he did. The question is, what it costs a man to speak truth in the wrong room. Kincaid went on to command the 7th Fleet during the liberation of the Philippines. He was promoted to the rank of Admiral. He received the Distinguished Service Medal and retired with full honors. His career suffered nothing from the long-range strike debacle of October 25 or from the downgrade of Vejtasa's medal. Vejtasa, who was right about the strike and who then saved the carrier the next morning, retired as a captain. Yet Vejtasa never uttered a public word against Kincaid. He never gave bitter interviews. He never campaigned for the medal. When asked near the end of his life if he was a hero, he pointed to Robin Lindsay, the landing signal officer who guided crippled planes onto a damaged deck. That answer, that deflection, reveals more about Stanley Vejtasa than any decoration ever could. A man who shot down 7 enemy aircraft in a single morning, who broke a torpedo attack that could have lost the Pacific War, who watched his Medal of Honor disappear into an admiral's bruised ego, and who responded by honoring someone else's courage instead of mourning his own lost recognition. That is not bitterness. That is the kind of character that no medal can measure and no bureaucracy can diminish. 7 aircraft destroyed in a single sortie, 5 torpedo bombers in 15 minutes, 1 carrier saved, 0 medals of honor awarded. That is the story of Swede Vejtasa, and now you know it. But most people do not. Most people have never heard the name Stanley Vejtasa. Most people do not know that the last American carrier in the Pacific was saved by a former dive bomber pilot from Montana, flying a fighter he had only been in for 4 months. That is where you come in. Hit that like button right now. Not for us, for him. Every like sends this video to someone new, someone who should know what this man did above the Santa Cruz Islands on October 26, 1942. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We dig through Navy action reports, through carrier deck logs, through Navy cross citations to find men like Vejtasa, men who were passed over. Men whose medals were downgraded by officers who valued their own pride more than their pilot's sacrifice. We pull these stories out of the archives, and we tell them. Every single week. Drop a comment below. Tell us where you are watching from. Tell us if someone in your family served, any branch, and any era. This comment section is not just a comment section, it is a roll call, and every name matters. Thank you for watching. Thank you for staying to the end. And thank you for making sure that Lieutenant Stanley Swede Vejtasa finally gets what the United States Navy should have given him 8 decades ago. Recognition.